Okay, we're coming towards the end of our program, and we'll be rounding things off on a forward-looking note with our closing plenary of today, Building the Future Regenerative Cities. I'd like to invite our moderator for this discussion, Jessica Cham, founder and managing director, Ecobusiness, to join us on stage. And joining her are our distinguished guests, Dr. Winston Chow, co-chair, Working Group 2 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Professor of Urban Climate at the Singapore Management University, Andy Hodgson, Global Advisory Services Lead, ARU, Dr. Hossein Reza Jorabi, Global Design Director, Rumble, and Diana Torres, Regional Governance Advisor, UNDP Asia and the Pacific. Shall we give them a warm round of applause, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, with that, I'll hand over the time to Jessica.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for being with us to this point in the agenda. I'd like to say that we like to save the best for last. That will be unfair to our previous panels because all of them have been really, really insightful today. But I'm really privileged to be moderating this closing plenary, and I think it's really, really apt that we've put building the future and regenerative cities on the agenda, sort of wrap up the conversations that we've had today. And it's been extremely interesting to hear the insights of all the practitioners, the investors, stakeholders in the built environment sector who have been living and breathing these problems on the ground and really giving us what are some of their thoughts about how to go forward. So to just start off this panel, I want to throw it back to you. I know I stand between you and drinks, and we will have lots of drinks later. But if you can sort of participate in our Slido poll, I want to ask all of you this one question, and that is, what does a regenerative city mean to you? So if you could just give me some thoughts, and I can see Winston there already, like eagerly anticipating the definitions. He's an expert on regenerative cities. So while all of you start, giving us some thoughts on what you think a regenerative city means to you, allow me to set some context. Regenerative cities are urban developments designed to restore and enhance the natural systems that they depend on. Unlike traditional cities that often deplete resources, regenerative cities aim to create a symbiotic relationship with the environment, actively improving the ecosystems around them. I remember some 6-7 years ago, I actually traveled to Copenhagen and did a documentary with Channel News Asia called Confronting Climate Change. And this documentary was actually the first ever that CNA put on their channels on climate change. And we had gone to Copenhagen to study many of the examples there. And I actually interviewed somebody from Rumble, Christian, I think, who actually took me through this area called St. Anne Square. And St. Anne Square had used to be a disused, flooded area that was poor and was suffering a lot of urban issues. But Rambo came in and they started designing this square. And what really, really sort of resonated with me were that there were some inverted umbrellas, I believe, in St. Anne Square that actually captured rainwater to prevent flooding in the area and to actually distribute this water into the city system. So I know a bit about Copenhagen, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from you. Closer to home, we have Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park, which Dr. Winston Chow is extremely proud about. That is a prime example of how we can actually integrate urban planning into our physical spaces to enhance not just citizen well-being, but also to actually address climate mitigation and adaptation. So with this sort of overarching narrative in mind, I'd like to start off with my question for the opening panel. And I think you can see some of the key words that have come up: harmony with nature, symbiotic, self-sufficiency, circularity, livable, resilient. These are all great words, and we're glad to see everyone participating. So I'd like to perhaps, start off with Dr. Winston Chow. Thank you for joining us. Drawing on your experience and your perspectives, what is your personal definition of regenerative city, and how do you think we're doing in terms of aligning the regenerative city with international climate action?
Difficult questions, Jess. Thank you. First, thank you for inviting me, and thank everybody who are here in person and also online. By the way, it's now exam season in SMU, so you've just given me a very good exam question to set for my students. I can think of a few things, apart from saying all of the above, from the excellent set of words that have been circulated on the Slido. I think a regenerative city should have 3 characteristics. One is that it enables rather than hinders. So it enables people to come together, enables people to put forward solutions that can work towards the ends of climate resilience or in sustainability. Whatever barriers that are in place towards financing, towards sharing knowledge should be minimized. I think this is the best practices that we've learned when, for instance, in the last IPCC assessment for cities, we looked into particular case studies on which these sort of practices that enable resilience and sustainability were to the forefront, and we found that enabling conditions were a very key characteristic of this successful cities for climate action. Second is that there is a regenerative city reads and listens rather than talks. What do I mean by this? There's a lot of very good science-based knowledge from your best academics, your best practitioners, pointing out what works. All you have to do, the solutions are there. All you have to do is sit down, read, understand, rather than talk about it. So if a city that focuses on regeneration puts that as a premium rather than just empty words that signify, sound and fury signifying nothing, so on and so forth. It's time to put that into action. That to me is a very important characteristic of a regenerative city. And finally, the third point which I wanted to say is that a regenerative city plans for the future. It's not short-term, it's not ad hoc. You actually get people together in an inclusive manner to plan for your goals in a not just for the short term, but for the medium term, for the long term. And it aligns itself with other cities as well. So those are the three things I hope that can, stir the pot somewhat in trying to see how all these terms that you see behind me can fit in together for a regenerative city.
Thank you very much, Winston. I will take those answers and share them with your students so they can get an A on that question. We'll come back to some of the points that you raised, but I want to come to Andy. Andy, at Arup, you guys have just issued a new report that have actually ranked cities all over the world in their terms of competitiveness. And what actually caught my eye was that Singapore ranked high because of its city in a garden approach. So in terms of your own definitions or Arup's definition of what a regenerative city is like, what are some of the best case examples that you see?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you as well for having me, and some great words, and also from Winston as well, some great sort of intro there. Maybe if I have two definitions, if I can sneak a second one in, because Eric, we represent quite a broad sort of capability, everything from the design side through to the more economics and finance, which is my part of the world. If I talk, if I can, on behalf of our design colleagues, they're always talking about great ideas around the symbiosis between nature and humanity and how the city bears that out. And some of the good examples we've seen. So if you look at Shanghai, for example, such an incredibly huge city that has really disrupted the way that water is caught and water is regenerated through the cycle. So there's a lot of work there done around how to bring nature into that. So great example there. But we talk then more sort of my side of the spectrum, which is more economics and finance. Where we're sort of going with this is more around like the donut economics concept. So how can we move away from just optimizing growth, optimizing economic outcomes and economic growth, and look more at creating that breadth of outcomes? So if you look at some of the cities we have around the world, I think firstly, when they go through the donut economic exercise, you see all are failing, in inverted commas. There are trade-offs that are happening. If you look at some of the most progressed economies in the world, whilst they're doing incredibly well with the fundamentals of human living. So jobs, for example, water, healthcare, when you look at the ecological impacts, there is a big negative impact. And I think we'll come on to the city's competitive later, but I think that's where cities are competing at the moment, is creating that balance and that in tune. And we'll talk about that later.
Thank you so much, Andy. And I think, going to the donut economics concept, earlier today, in the speech that I gave, the UN is trying to promote this idea of measuring human progress and well-being beyond GDP. And I think donut economics is a really good model to sort of follow, because it advocates for growth and development within our planetary boundaries. the people in the room, you haven't heard of donut economics, go and search it up. It's actually an emerging economic theory that's been very popular recently. But for now, I'll come to Hossein. And Rambo has been, a practitioner in this space for a long time, and you have actually had many, many innovative designs. I had a quick read of that report that you sent me on regenerative thinking. Very, very fascinating, and a lot of examples in there. So, share with us what is your and Rambo's definition of that, and how can we apply that into the cities that we see around the world and in Asia?
Sure. Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation, for that beautiful question. If I may start by making a comment on the beautiful word cloud that we just saw. When you see things like that, I find that highly encouraging, and at the same time highly alarming, if I may share that with you. Encouraging in that, of course, we're all here engaged with the topic, we're trying to find solutions, define the problem, and identify where we want to be, etc., etc. So that is highly encouraging. A lot of us are doing work, some of us professionally, others out of interest. Some of us is our occupation, others is our preoccupation. I find it alarming at the same time in that there is such huge diversity in what we think these two words mean, regenerative city. And when there's such diversity, it means that there is no alignment between us, even people like us who've decided to spend our day here. And we are generally more aligned than we are with most other people because they're spending their time somewhere else trying to talk or learn, etc. But even within us, there is such huge diversity. And that is what makes me think, and that's something that we're doing within Rambo. We need to stay at the problem definition stage a little bit more. This idea that what is a regenerative city, how do you get there, what does it look like, what does it feel, show me the solution, etc. I think it's a little bit premature in terms of where we are. So, these sort of exercises are beautiful, are very good, but it sort of reinforces my view, and I share that with you, that we need to stay a little bit more at the definition stage. What is the problem that we are trying to solve, and where do we want to go? If we don't have agreement on where we want, what we want, we don't have agreement on what we don't want, by definition at the same time. Now, my definition of regeneration generally is within, again, within Ramble, the ideas that we have developed in the past few years, is that we see the regenerative design as a subsetting to regenerative thinking, which itself is a subsetting to regenerative worldview or regenerative paradigm, if I may use the P word. Now, within regenerative design, which is the things that we are practicing as engineers, architects, scientists, etc., there are certain drivers, etc., that we have defined, we worked with, and we publish and share within the industry. Regenerative thinking has a different language. It's culture. You need to have regenerative culture. You need to be, the lexicon is different, and regenerative worldview has to do with politics, with economics. It's a completely different paradigm. Now, we cannot be truly regenerative if we are not engaged with this issue at all these three levels. Now, one of the best books I have even to date read on this, which I highly recommend, in fact, is written by that gentleman there, Nirmal, Eco-Puncture, with beautiful examples of what regenerative buildings are, what regenerative neighborhoods are, etc., etc. So, and there are a lot of other publications, of course, including ours, which I do a bit of propaganda for Ramble. But I recommend that we all need to discuss the problem stage a little bit more.
So, if I could challenge you, how would you define that problem? You say that's the problem stage. How would you define it for us right now?
Well, I would say that, for instance, to a lot of us talk about regenerative cities as if we're talking about regenerating urban environments, regenerating neighborhoods, etc., which is only within the monospecies definition. It's about people. It's about regenerating a neighborhood to bring people back in create some activities, some economic activities, etc., etc. There is room for that, of course. We need to be doing that. But when we talk about regenerative design and regenerative environment, we're talking about regenerating the environment, that healing of the environment, that breakage that has happened between the built environment and the natural environment, and how we can make that connection. And that has got a series of steps, a series of things, ideas of system thinking, ideas of complexity thinking, etc., which I'm happy to discuss. But the definition is, regenerative city is in fact an oxymoronic terminology. City is an artificial thing. Regeneration is to do with nature. When you say regenerative city, we are talking about artificial, natural. So, which again, we should talk about it.
Like artificial intelligence.
That goes into the lexicon of regeneration, that it is even, the lexicon is different. And we can talk about it, I'm happy to.
Super fascinating, thank you. I like what you said about the breakage between the urban and the natural environment. And I think this is not something that we often speak about. But Diana, I want to bring you into the conversation now. You're at UNDP, and UNDP obviously has a mandate in the Asia-Pacific region here to help developing countries develop in a way that's prosperous, that's sustainable. What are your personal thoughts on what a regenerative city, is in Asia, and have you seen, good examples of that?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for having us here, UNDP. As you mentioned, I am based in Bangkok, and I'm the regional governance advisor. We in UNDP have 24 country offices. If you are not familiar with UNDP, we're supporting 36 countries across Asia Pacific in the localization of the SDGs. So this is quite at the heart of our work. And this year, actually, we started a new initiative called Leadership for the Future, enhancing urban governance practices to support prosperous, sustainable, and inclusive cities in Asia Pacific. So it's a discussion that we are starting to have with many colleagues and in the UN, but also governments across the region. And if we may continue the conversation about the concept and how do we define it, for us, a regenerative city will be a city that is present responsive to the current challenges, aspirations, and needs of its people, and also is nature conscious, as well as ready for the future. As I said, is a city that is people-centered in the first place. And people-centered means that it's inclusive and that takes into account the needs and aspirations of different sectors of society, especially of the most vulnerable, people with disabilities, women, children, the elderly, migrants, and all sectors of society, but also that is nature conscious. And it's an interesting concept because it integrates, it invites us to think in an integrated way on how we could support cities as to bring together the rights of people, human rights, and realize the rights of present generations as well as future generations, as well conserving and protecting our planet. So this is how we're seeing the concept of regenerative cities. In terms of good examples, I think we are finding great inspiration in Singapore, I might say, and we're trying also to kind of bring through city-to-city exchanges. Actually, last week, 2 weeks ago, we just held a policy dialogue in Bangkok, where we brought 10 cities across the region, and we invited Singapore to share its experience in terms of integrated and long-term planning, and how these concepts of putting people at the center while the planet are helping Singapore to build resilience and embrace this concept of regenerative cities. I'll stop here, happy to share more later
Yes,
on.
no, thank you, Diana. And I think Professor Khoo Teng Chai had mentioned in the morning, some of the policies that Singapore instituted in the 70s and 80s that then actually stood as well. But then these standards need constant updating. And perhaps on this topic, I can, throw it back to you, Winston, in terms of, the unique challenges that Singapore faced in particular. And then also drawing from your experience as one of the co-chairs of the IPCC, studying all that climate science and data that's coming out, which is not a pretty picture, we will have to say, the UN report. I mean, what do you think enables cities to make that difference in terms of governance, like putting in place the policies that are needed to help build these cities that we want?
Challenging questions there, Jess. So for the Singapore context, what could be important? I mean, I'm sure Teng Chai has covered quite a bit of ground in terms of the success story that Singapore has in tackling a lot of very emerging, or still emerging, climate-driven impacts, physical risks, and also other transition risks that occur. But I want to add a little caveat there. I think I got into trouble the last time saying something along the lines of, has Singapore been too successful in dealing with some
Victim
of
of its
the...
own success?
Not a victim of its own success. We've become so successful in dealing, for instance, with water scarcity and with flooding, and dealing with droughts with the 4 taps and the sort of flood control, where we've reduced the amount of flood-prone areas in Singapore down to about 50 to 55 football fields in size. Are we complacent in that? So the challenge is to tell people, look, this is not your generation's climate that you are used to. It's going to change in the future, and we have to start adapting to that. So the fear of people becoming complacent in saying, oh, we already tackled this one particular physical risk is already, it's embedded in some manner, shape, or form, and we want to disabuse that. So there's a lot of scientific research from many different institutes here, from the various autonomous universities, showcasing that those risks are emerging, and one has to adapt to that. If not for the physical aspect, there is that transition risk aspect where it will affect your bottom line if you do not account for this in your long-term planning. So it's an ongoing struggle to inform stakeholders in that sense. Sorry, Jess, there was the other question about governance and what can be done. There's good interactions that the current government is learning from best practices elsewhere in terms of trying to include as many stakeholders in their decision making as much as possible, trying to move away from purely economic aspects of judging the success of a particular climate policy, which is essential. Other things that can be improved upon perhaps would be to focus in on including different stakeholders. I'm focused a lot on heat in Singapore, and we know that heat disproportionately affects a lot of outdoor workers who are in Singapore from migrant workers from other countries. Making sure that they are protected in the age of 35, 36, 37 degrees Celsius temperatures is going to be an important concern if you want to reduce the sort of vulnerabilities of these people. Also, in the other sorts of risks that will emerge, I like eating. We're going to go for drinking and food. Food security is a massive problem for a place like Singapore, which is extremely vulnerable to lots of droughts that not just affect us, but also in the region as well. We don't have a bread basket per se. We diversify our food imports. But when different parts of the world where you rely on all your key food essentials are going to get hit in the years to come with more frequent and intense weather events that will affect your food supply and the supply chain, how are you going to account for that, and how can you be adaptive in that sense? It's a challenge that governments will have to think about. And lastly, policies that help to keep a city regenerative, which are inclusive, has that climate justice element in there. There needs to be some sort of teeth to the policy. You can only go so far with a lot of carrots to stakeholders, but at what point will you start bringing in the stick? Carbon tax is one example in Singapore. Are there other ways in which these particular sticks can help encourage the right thing to do for a city, or a city-state in this case, to become regenerative?
Thank you so much, Winston. Andy and Jose, I'm going to bring you into this conversation in terms of governance mechanisms and regulatory frameworks. What do you see are some of the biggest challenges here in a region like Asia?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, because I think we touched on at the beginning of the introduction a couple of examples of good practice, Amokyo, for example, but some of these examples are like 10 years old. Why are they not everywhere? And not just in Singapore, but around the world. Why are they not everywhere? Why is this no longer the norm? Why aren't, aspects like this mandated? For example, I work for Arup, and we took it on ourselves in the last couple of years to actually capture, document all the carbon in all our projects. Not just in that year, but going back through what we've done and looking at the outturn, what happens in the next few years. Why are we making that choice? That should be all companies doing that. So I think that sort of gives a hint at the gap between reality and what we say we want to do. It's just there.
Is it a capacity building issue, like lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, or what do you think is happening there?
Yeah, absolutely. And not just in Singapore. If I take Southeast Asia, for example, and a lot of the work that we do is looking at project development, so getting ideas off the ground. And we see one of the biggest gaps is not capital. It's not funding that everyone says. It's due to the capacity and capability of governments to make the right choices. And that's not just at the decision-making layer. We have all the new layers coming through of government employees, and a lot of them have some great ideas, but don't have a way of putting them into practice. So we're finding that there is a need to support at all the different layers in government, and then the private sector will come in behind it.
Really, really interesting. Hossein, any thoughts?
Yes, one of the attributes of regeneration that we promote is humility. But if I may put that to one side and say that we have all the answers. We have all the technical answers to all the technical problems that exist to do with the environment. IPCC's report came out last year, addressed a lot of them. Technically, we know how to decarbonize, we know how to enhance biodiversity. In a side, we can't get the dinosaurs back. So whatever has been lost, unfortunately. But within the city, within a neighborhood, we can enhance biodiversity. We know how to deal with forests and trees and this, that, and the other. So it's not lack of technical knowledge. It is the fundamental flaw that exists in the way we value things, our economy, and a fundamental flaw in the way we consider representative democracy as if it is democracy. That our economic system as well as our political system. Now, we have identified about 32 drivers of regenerative design within that small sphere of regenerative design. One of them, of course, is water. How do we work with water? How do we enhance the treatment of water on a site in a neighborhood so that it is better when we finish the project than it was before? The other one is carbon, of course, the biodiversity, greenery, etc. But one of them is also economy. The way we value things, the reason why we are so have failed so badly in reducing CO2 numbers, and they keep continuously go up, and every year we get a new number around October, which is bigger than before. It's not that we don't know how to decarbonize. It's not that we don't have a lot of engineers, a lot of scientists, a lot of architects, etc., who are working on that front to try and bend that curve. It's because we don't have that political will that exists. And when we apply that will, it's applied within a system which is fundamentally going the wrong way. So even if you run in the right direction, the train is going south, we're running very fast in the north direction, but overall we end up in the south direction. So it needs a systemic approach to it. I know it's a little bit evangelical, if I may be given the latitude to be a little bit evangelical, but I think that is that's where the source of the problem is. And hence, yes, within Singapore, we have a lot of buildings that have regenerative attributes to them. A famous Ramble sentence we've developed within Ramble, that we all say that, is that there is no regenerative building, there's no regenerative neighborhood in the entire world yet. There are buildings which have regenerative attributes. They're regenerative vis-a-vis water, regenerative vis-a-vis greenery, etc. And we've got quite a lot of examples in Singapore. But one that is totally regenerative doesn't exist. We're working towards it, but it is not about lack of technical knowledge.
That's super interesting.
We know how to do it.
And I think, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I think Hussein's dropped a really interesting point here, and it links to that capacity and capability part before. I think the first side is political cycles.
Yeah.
A lot of decisions are made around political cycles, which don't often look at the long term. And I think that also comes down to there is a lack, and I'm going to get quite specific now. So when projects are put forward, there is obviously then an economic appraisal. Should we do this? What are the outcomes it's going to achieve versus what are the costs of doing it? And there is still, in many parts of the world, a lack of clear guidance in how do you value some of these intrinsic outcomes. And it's not getting onto the paper. And therefore, when you link that with the political cycle, you're starting to see projects put to the fore, which are all about instantaneous returns. And they may be shorter travel times, they may be increased employment, whatever it might be. And if you go back to the donuts, they're looking at one part of it. And I think Hussein's great point, it links the two together, the capacity and capability, the political will, and the lack of understanding of the economic outcomes to achieve.
That's super fascinating. I think Vince and I were just lamenting about the US election that's upcoming, and God help us, America decide correctly. But
I know we're being recorded, so I have to say that. I'm not talking about politicians. I'm talking about the political system that prevails in the world. At the moment.
The
it is not about
institutions, you mean?
people. It is about a system. You know, we have great people in various parts of the world dedicating their lives and their livelihood to the betterment of everybody else's well-being, etc., trying to help, getting involved with things, the sort of thing that maybe some of us here would rather not do because we get a kick out of doing a good building design or something else. So there are a lot of good people doing that thing. It's about a system. And that is something that, you know, as we've all heard, you know, we don't rise to the level of our ambitions, as said by a beautiful guy. We fall to a level of our system. It doesn't matter how big or lofty our ambitions are. If our systems produces an outcome which is degenerative, we can think as regeneratively as we like. We continue to produce degenerative outcome.
So basically, our political systems are broken. Not sure we can solve that in this panel, but Diana, I want to bring you in because you work with governments at UNDP, and the political systems are what they are. Of course, we're trying to improve that constantly, and we've seen the UN SecGen, you know, sort of declare this pact for the future and for future generations. How are you guys thinking about this, and how do you solve for some of the broken institutions or the perverse incentives and the fact that we're not getting the outcomes that we want?
Yeah, no, indeed, it's quite worrisome, the trends that we are observing in the region in terms of democratic governance, what we call democratic backsliding, shrinking civic space, where these trends actually are not very cooperative and aligned with this concept of regenerative cities. So yeah, it's quite worrisome. And at the same time, and this is where we find that change is not going to happen unless we focus on enhancing governance and making governance systems fit for purpose. Some of the models of governance that we are seeing in the region are quite old-fashioned and very top-down still, where there is still a culture of lack of integrity, lack of transparency, which is undermining the possibility of trust. And without trust, there is not citizen engagement, not participation of private sector, and then no possibility of collaboration and co-creating the future that we're talking about. So this is the reality, and this is what for us is fundamental and really important to really bring inspiration and change in terms of how governance works at national and subnational level across the region. There are many challenges on top of that. Of course, there is the issue of capabilities and leadership as well. In terms of capabilities, what we continue seeing in the region is really the prevalence of short-term visions, lack of long-term vision when it comes to urban planning. Continuous silo approach and sectoral approach, and not kind of a systemic approach on how do we approach urban development and sustainable development, and how do we integrate issues of climate change, but rapid urbanization and social inequality into the urban planning exercise. And then, of course, leadership, in terms of leadership, not really equipped with the tools to use data and informed decision-making when it comes to understanding trends, models, impacts. This is still quite a gap in the region in terms of how we equip leaders and local governments with the tools and the data to make informed decision-making. And of course, related to the shrinking civic space, lack of participation and collaboration with citizens and communities. Continue the prevalence of very top-down governance models where governments are coming with their solutions in closed office without any consultation or co-creation space with citizens, which of course will lead to like inefficient policies and unsustainable policies and solutions to address urban challenges. So in that framework, what we are promoting from UNDP is kind of in terms of principles. How do we go about it? This is a very diverse region with different political systems, different administrative systems at local level. But at least we should align some principles on how do we move forward urban governance in the region. So we have come up with 5 interlinked principles that hopefully will continue driving and orienting governance systems and urban planning in the region. One is promoting multi-level governance and a whole-of-government approach. Really, the problem in this region is that there is no collaboration between national and local level, and there is actually incoherent, regular frameworks, lack of coordination, lack of coherence. So, for example, in Bangkok, the governor of Bangkok has very limited authority regarding the roads and transportation system. For him to be able to manage the roads, he really needs a cooperation with the national level. And this is just one example of many other examples that are happening in the region in terms of the necessity of collaboration between national and local level when it comes to designing policies, but also managing and implementing regulatory frameworks. The second is driving locally owned and inclusive development. We need to put people at the center as well of the solutions. The solutions are there. It's not about more money nor more technical solutions. Actually, the communities know better what is best for them. They know what are the needs, they know what their aspirations are. So how do we ensure that women, people with disability, are part of the co-creation of solutions, and therefore we are shaping a future that is jointly designed by local actors. We are also supporting governments, and we are promoting the concept of anticipation, adaptability, and agility, making sure that governments are able to use foresight, system thinking, data-informed decision-making to anticipate the future and plan for the future, because we need to really counter this short-term vision and very kind of silo approach to looking at development. And then another one is, of course, aligning public and private capital flows and partnerships. It has been mentioned a lot throughout the day, and the potential of working together, public and private sector, to align investments, but also in the co-creation of solutions. And the last point that we are promoting is really cultural preservation and economic opportunities, ensuring that cultural preservation in urban development brings the potential to create and foster greener economic opportunities in the future. So these are some of the principles we are trying to promote in the region. Happy to continue.
Thank you for the 5 points and principles. I think that's very actionable. With an eye on the time, I want to start throwing questions at you that's from our audience here. If we can get the Slido poll up, and if anyone actually has a reflection or a question in person, we'd be happy to take that as well. Any of you? Wow, there's so many. Okay, so I think we've had a great conversation around the governance mechanisms and some frameworks that we can follow. But I think if I can pick up one thing that you said about capital flows, and I think we talked about finance a little bit in the morning as well, and we're looking at COP29 in Azerbaijan and discussion that's coming up. Climate finance for cities is something that's perhaps a little bit under the radar, and I was quite amazed when I was in the other session and Maria had mentioned it taken us 28 COPs to actually get cities on the agenda to be discussed in a serious manner. So perhaps the gentleman can take this question as I digest all the other ones. Yeah. You can take, because you're from the IPCC.
What was the question again, with the context?
The question is, how can we get governments to put more money for cities, right? I mean, regenerative cities, yes, but how can we actually get that funding going? Because, we've talked about public-private capital flows and the fact that we have a 30 trillion financing gap for cities.
Yep. Simple, just at a very basic level, the money that you invest in adaptation, in mitigation, starting from cities towards reducing your emissions, towards having in concepts like sponge cities using nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptations, putting them in place right now, it gives you more bang for the buck as opposed to the costs that you will face in a very increasingly climate-disrupted world. That said, I mean, these conversations we started last year, even before, before Dubai and COP28. The hope is that there'll be some discussion ongoing in COP29. Personally, I am not optimistic. You can put me on the record saying that. Given that I don't think a lot of the key stakeholders will be attending Baku. I was in New York Climate Week and speaking to some of the principals there. I think there's some discouragement in attending there for a variety of reasons, one of which will take place next Tuesday, if memory serves, in the US. So I think everybody's in a wait-and-see mode in terms of how best to carry on the discussions that took place in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Dubai, and onto Baku and onto Belém in the following year as well. So, yeah.
Thank you for charting that picture for us, and hopefully we'll get some action out of it. We have a few questions here on Singapore, and maybe Andy, I'll get you to take this one, because I suppose it's talking to the tension perhaps between the need to conserve things like our forests and natural spaces, but then also with development, and how can you reconcile those needs? Perhaps not just for Singapore, but let's broaden it to other cities as well.
Yeah, I do have an observation on this actually, because I remember there was a recent bit of work looking at the value of retaining the mangroves, for example. And there was a lack of capability to actually assess what is the value for that. Not just those who enjoy it and go and see them, but just to have it available. And I think that's one of the tensions that's playing out, is being able to put a level of preservation and then leading to regeneration around this. Can I be super cheeky and link this into my shameless plug for the city's competitive we've done? Because actually it is an element of what makes a city competitive. So competitiveness used to always be around the intrinsic efficiency of a city. So super efficient cities get people from A to B, high quality of life from that perspective, and grow from a GDP perspective. What we're seeing now is actually cities are using the nature around it to become more competitive. It enhances quality of life. It enhances that intrinsic connection, so the livability elements of it. And we're seeing that those who aren't doing it are turning into the cookie cutter cities that could be anywhere in the world. So to go back to the question before about how can we sort of promote more funds to be available to cities to help enhance what they do from a nature perspective. I think that's one of them, is actually it does help you become more competitive. It helps you attract and retain talent. It helps you attract and retain capital as well. Look at Miami. They did a $500 billion forever bond, it was called. And that was all around enhancing these areas. And that's enhanced their own economic growth over the last few years. So there's certainly a trigger to do it. It just needs the political impetus to move it.
Well said, thank you. And Hossein, perhaps we can get you to take two questions here. There's one question, if you can elaborate about your comment on democracy, but really the more interesting question here is, I think, on showcase projects. Are we playing lip service by having, these token, I suppose, regenerative cities, some projects around? Or are you seeing true momentum from the work that you're doing, profiling these case studies?
No, we definitely see a lot of positive movement in that direction. We see a lot of people talking about it. We see a lot of people thinking about it. We see a lot of people wanting to do things. And that is good. One of the concerns that we have is that some of us have the tendency of going back and looking at things that we did like 30 years ago, said, oh, by the way, that was, and repackage that as a regenerative project and present that as that. And so that we've always been regenerative. I don't think anybody has always been regenerative. Anybody who says that is not being truthful, perhaps. So we need to be careful with what is happening on that front. But a lot of people are active in the space, and it is good that we are active in the space. We need to be careful not to let this what happened to the S word of sustainability to some extent, the failure of sustainability to achieve the goals that were defined in Brundtland report 35, 37 years ago, etc. For that not to happen to the R word of regeneration. And but a lot of good things are happening. In Singapore, there are a lot of good case studies, examples of buildings with good regenerative attributes. many. WOHA and others are the leading lights on that front, in my opinion. But maybe if I can say one or two things about things. We mentioned COP. And if I may continue to be my annoying self today, at least, right? Having talked about the democracy and government here, let me go international and talk about it. I have issues with COP being held in countries with huge amount of fossil fuel as their revenues. I have issues with that. I think it is trying to find a regenerative solution from within a highly degenerative way of thinking environment. And that will not happen. We may make one or two steps forward because it is cool to be regenerative now. So everybody wants to be regenerative. Everyone wants to talk about it, etc. And we might achieve one or two things on that front. But they will be the cause for our failure. And we need to be careful with that. I have issues with that. I have issues with people, with countries whose country was a country overshoot date. The country overshoot date, the date within 1 year, I'm sure you all know that, but the date within 1 year's calendar, starting from January till December, when if everybody in the world consumed like the average person in that country, the renewable resources of the planet would finish on that date instead of finishing by December or continue on to next year. I have issues with people who are in February and March hosting this sort of events. Yeah, I don't think they're being. If they're trying, that is fine. But I think they are being disingenuous, and we need to be careful.
That's super interesting.
We need to be custodians of these ideas.
We did see, though, at COP28 last year, the historic language of transitioning away from fossil fuels that was achieved there. But Winston, perhaps we'll bring...
Transition is one of those key words. I'm very suspicious of transition.
I'm going to join... can I interrupt?
Yeah, go on.
Because I think I was challenged by some people here to be provocative and be on the record. Devil's advocate, being in my position and hearing things, I agree. I can agree with what you said. I can understand and appreciate the stance you're taking. But when I give those arguments, this is what I get back from people. They say that your ideas are great on paper, but it neglects the important D word, development. You do not account for development in the global south. You do not account for any sort of development that is politically viable. You can talk all you want about sustainability. You can talk all you want about regenerative cities. But when the rubber hits the road, how do you put that down on paper that can make this politically viable for people to actually accomplish that? That's something I struggle with, and I would love to hear your thoughts about that. It's fun to be annoying, but how do you respond to that?
We're starting the debate now.
How long do we have? Like a couple of days? Can I have a chat?
5 seconds.
I've had this for a year, so...
Let's do it over drinks later. And did you have some last thoughts on that?
No, I might be gilding the lily on this one, but I think, but no, I think from the perspective that we've sort of toyed with this as well as an organisation, because we've been at the forefront of, let's use the sustainability word, for a long, long time, and we thought, do we actually want to work in these countries? Should we be working there? And where we've got to is actually it's maybe a little bit elitism to say we shouldn't. And actually, how do you change things from the inside out? That's so much easier. And rather than say, this is our club, and you're going to be part of our club if you get to this threshold, I can't see people coming up. I can't see organisations and countries getting up to that. But being part of a broader network, I can. I think that's sort of where we got to as an organisation. But
well said.
Don't want to take this too far.
With an eye on the time, I think I'll just wrap up this panel with some, just one question, and perhaps taking also into account the conversations we had about, how much you need to engage, even in difficult situations. What do you think is the one hope and action that we should take today that would help us to build regenerative cities? I know it's a sort of cop-out question, but to help us inspire action, Diana, you can go first.
Well, what I would like to see, and my hope is that we can support what we call transformative governance models, and it's really moving and pushing for the concept of collaborative governance more, making it a reality, because we talk a lot about it, and we mention a lot the importance of public-private cooperation to make development happen. We talk about the engagement of communities also as a principle, but progress is slow and it's not happening. So really is our commitment, especially from those that have the luxury to have resources and capabilities, to share them and to support developing countries to embrace these kind of transformative governance models, joining more collaborative approaches and supporting collaboration that embraces academic work, private sector, citizens and community knowledge with government capabilities. So that will be my hope.
Thank you. Well said. Thank you, Hussein.
I think the hope definitely is that a repetition of what we spoke about. We have all the solutions. Component-wise, we know how to deal with most of the environmental challenges that we have. We've had it for many years. What we need to do is to make sure that we put them together in a new system that produces the outcome that we are looking for. Now, do we have all the answers? No, Winston. Unfortunately, we don't. You're one of the stalwarts of working towards those solutions. We don't have the answer to all the solutions, but there are solutions that we know do not work. We should abandon those. Otherwise, we'll be working on so many solutions that some of them are old, some of them are new, some of them work, some of them don't work. So for every new solutions that we come up with, we need to abandon an old solution so that we have the capacity to be processing these things and producing the outcome that we all want.
Well said as well. Thank you, Andy.
I'll be super quick because I think we've talked about a lot of the sort of simple, not simple, the hard things we can do. But I think the simple one, if it could be simple, is supporting social coherence. Make this just the obvious choice. Make people understand the value, see the opportunity, and then just get behind it. And I think that will make a lot of the change that we need, not going top down all the time.
Thank you very much. And Winston.
Thanks, Jess. I will go to one of my favorite philosophers, Vanilla Ice. He had this song called Ice Ice Baby, where the important words is stop, collaborate, and listen. Diana talked about trust, which I think is missing in a lot of our systems right now. You need to collaborate, you need to listen, and you need to, first of all, stop to build that trust, which is so important to get stuff done, to build the new systems that we need for any aspects of sustainability, for resilience, or for regeneration. And the other thing I would point out is another T word, time. We don't have that much time left, and we need to get stuff done. Paradoxically, we have to stop, but we have to make sure we know where we're going in the time that we have left.
Very well said. And production team, we're going to have Ice Ice Baby playing in our networking drinks later. But I just wanted to end with, coming back to Diana, progress is a slog. So let's keep slogging, but let's have fun and let's have purpose while doing it. Please join me to thank our speakers for a wonderful discussion.